thank you again. Thank you again so much for being here with us today. So Robin, tell us about your life, your journey, and what led to spurring the release of more than 2,000 trap fishermen. Over to you.
Okay, I have spent most of my career as a foreign correspondent, starting in Cambodia and then going to Thailand, Indonesia, and then finally Myanmar. And this story really meant a lot to me because it really touched on all those countries and like little things that I had seen and understood along the way. Another colleague who's not here today is Margie Mason, who also had spent most of her career in Southeast Asia. And we worked together on a lot of big projects. And this is one that had interested us. And we were really looking at it from, based on what we were hearing about abuses on the fishing boats and some people telling like little pieces of the story during the course of our reporting. So in Margie's case, she was interviewing fishermen about HIV, and this was years ago. They started talking about how they would be out to sea for months at a time, and sometimes only touching land every 6 months, and just how brutal those conditions were. And those kind of things just plant a seed in your brain. It's not necessarily something you're going to go and start digging into, because there's so many stories all over the world, especially in developing countries, that you're trying to find, how do we make these stories resonate? How do we make it more than just a story about, oh yeah, if you're an American reader or a European reader, like children in Nepal being abused in the carpet industry, or Bangladeshi factory workers, or Vietnamese making Nike shoes. It's really I think the real goal starts to be, how do you make people care? So basically we came upon the idea really early. Well, I'll just tell it the way it happened because it's kind of more fun, especially for young people. I was in a bar, and Margie had just gone to a meeting where she was talking about some fishermen who had been abandoned in Indonesia. And after years of kind of saying like, how are we ever going to do this fisherman story? How are we going to do it? All we really know is what we're seeing in human rights reports or labor reports. And it's usually based on men who have fled or been rescued. Like, we just really haven't heard much firsthand or know how to make this matter. And so she called and she's like, what if we connect it to the American dinner table? And so that's kind of where the story originated. And we decided, we need to find men who are currently enslaved, get on their boats, and then find a way to follow that catch back to America and Europe. And it seemed like a great idea, and we were both very excited about it, but it soon became clear that this was not going to be as easy as we thought, and other people had tried to do it. And it basically, part of the problem is these boats are out to sea for months, sometimes years at a time. They have the big reefer ships that go around collecting the catch, so there's no need to go back to shore. And then those reefer ships go and bring it, Thailand is one of the biggest exporting ports. They bring it back there and often sell that fish at the market. So you're really not sure, what fish is legally caught and what fish is caught by people working under these really brutal conditions, because it all gets mixed together. And then small companies buy it, and then big companies buy it from the small companies. So you could tell that story, but you can't, it wouldn't really resonate with readers or people unless they knew there was a good chance that that whatever they were eating was coming from, these brutal conditions. And I really like the topic of today's talk, because the intersection between humans and the environment is so strong in the fishing industry. In Thailand, which was one of the biggest seafood exporting countries, they had for years been fishing right off their waters, and there were plenty of Thai fishermen who were willing to go on those boats. And then there was a big typhoon, and it destroyed, a lot of boats sank, and then they continued to overfish and destroyed the marine ecosystem around Thailand. So the boats started having to go farther and farther out to sea, Indonesia, as far as Africa. And they couldn't find Thai fishermen who wanted to go on those boats anymore because of their fear from the typhoon, and also because, because they were going so far out. But so they started basically kidnapping, selling men from impoverished countries in the region and putting them on these boats. So it really was in large due to overfishing and the destruction of the marine ecosystems that they had to start relying on forced labor. And this is all kind of things that we only came to understand really later. But so once we decided that we were gonna, tackle this, our first challenge, of course, was going to be to find men who were enslaved on boats. And that took a long time. It took about, I don't know, more than 6 months. And, it really was, we started figuring out, I mean, there were a lot of missteps, and we were chasing a lot of false leads. We were looking initially for a migratory tuna that went, that we knew that Thai boats were catching, but often were in the Indonesian waters, and knew from the IOM and Margie's contacts in Indonesia that many of the men who were stranded there or had been, detained after trying to flee had come from Thailand. So we eventually hooked up with a local NGO in Thailand who had been rescuing Thai fishermen kind of one at a time, and had started doing rescues in Indonesia, and was saying, like initially they were rescuing them off of Ambon, and then when the fishing operations became suspect, or Indonesians started cracking down, the operations would move out to farther islands. And eventually they had gone to what they considered probably the farthest island where there was fishing operation. It was pretty much halfway between Indonesia and Australia, and hadn't been there because it was really difficult to reach, especially with the monsoon waves and rains. There was only a few months a year that people could easily access it. And they wanted to make a trip there. And we said we wanted to join them. They at this point knew what we were kind of trying to do. So initially I went with a cameraman, a photographer, and a videographer, and to see what we were going to find. We had no idea really the extent of the abuses we were going to find, or the scale. And we arrived, and our first obstacle was the fishing village where they were going to drop us off was separated by about 200 meters of waterway between that and the company grounds. So that was the Benjina Pusaka Resources Company, which was private. So the question was, were we going to be able to get there to talk to men? And I spent a couple of days there and was able to find a couple of men who had escaped and lived in villages and had married local women. And this seemed to be pretty much the only way for men to escape the boats. If they tried to run away, there were basically slave catchers, people who would go and, rearrest them and put them on the boats and get money for them if they caught them. But if they married a local girl, the village would protect them because they needed more, just because of the whole community aspect, and they were contributing members of those really rough and tumble fishing communities where it was very hard to survive. So the initial interviews I did was with men who had escaped and talked about what had happened on the boats. And in some cases was a couple of years ago, they'd already been integrated into that community life, what type of fish they were catching, the brutal conditions that they or their friends had experienced. This could be anything from, people dying on the boats and then being thrown in the water, their bodies just being thrown in the water, horrible injuries that went left untreated, people, like bolts, when an arm was broken, just putting a bolt in between the bones, very like painful and horrific when you see the pictures or the scars from the people's hands on that. A lot of people getting caught in nets. Most of these fishermen, they were coming from several countries. Most of them were Burmese, but others were from Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. saying that, they had, because so many of them had left 5, 10, 15 years ago when there were no mobile phones, that they had no contact with their families. Their families thought they were dead, and that they were, basically just trapped. They thought that that was going to be that was going to be how they would live, and in many cases, they would almost rather die. And there were very often suicides. We heard of 2 while I was there, and then another when Esther arrived. That somebody had been talking about it. So after Esther, after I was there with the photographer and the videographer, we all had to check in with the police station and kind of register our names, what we were doing. They registered as journalists, and were able to go to the island kind of under the pretense of doing a good news story about Indonesia's rich marine life. And at the time there was a new fishing minister, and she was going to try to make all these changes to kind of improve the income and for Indonesia. So they were able to do some kind of good generic video of the fish being taken off the boats, loaded onto reefer ships, the big warehouses with just millions and millions of dollars worth of fish. And it was not the tuna that we were looking for, but it was literally every fish that was in those waters. Like I would take a book, and with Esther as well, of all the pictures of fish from the Maluku Island chain, and ask them, like, which fish were you catching? And it was pretty much every fish, check, check, check. So Esther came after a few days when the photographer, I didn't register as a journalist because I didn't want to be followed by the company minders and the village minders. So we kind of just let our videographer and photographer act as a decoy while I went and interviewed these villagers. And also they took us to a graveyard where they were burying people who had, under false names, who had died at sea and were being, in that case, put in the freezer and then brought back to shore and buried under their false, the false documents that they had been given when they were kidnapped. And we'll leave a little pause here to say that Esther's going to get back to a little bit when she arrived in her, and also her impression. But just to continue with the investigation, I'll try to make this a little quicker. When we were there, we saw the big reefer ship come and be loaded with fish. And there's a little hill that you could climb up. There was no mobile phone signal there, but if you climbed on this hill and you got high enough and there was no one else on the hill, you could get a couple bars of signal. And so and if you went in the middle of the night, there was a better chance that you could get a message out. So I was able to get messages out to Esther saying, you got to get your butt over here, because a lot of these men were Burmese, and we needed current workers who were currently on those boats to get to really do the supply chain tracking. We couldn't rely on guys who had been on there 2 years before. We need to see the fish that was being caught, talk to those men, and then follow that catch back to a Thai port and then America. So we used, I don't know if you all use it, but we used marine traffic to track the boats and to see, where they were going and what time they were going to arrive, so that we could meet those boats there. And the boat that we followed was a Silver Sea. And we knew that it was going to arrive in Samut Sakhon, Thailand, 15 days later. So as soon as we got off the island, we flew with Margie to Samut Sakhon and just basically waited in trucks for those fish to be offloaded, and then followed the trucks to the individual companies to see where it was going. And this, this was another part of the investigation that really was time consuming and very frustrating, because it took almost 2 months before we were able to find out who in America was buying that fish. The biggest exporting company was Thai Union, and they weren't buying it directly off of these boats. They were buying it from these little mom and pop shops, or like tiny companies that weren't sending it directly to America. So we had to find out like how is it getting to America, basically. Once we found out it was Thai Union, it basically hit every every big, like everyone from Whole Foods to Costco to Sam's Club to Target to, basically everybody could be tied to this fish in one way or another. Maybe I'll let Esther talk a little bit about what happened when she arrived, because like I said, I was having language problems. I could only communicate with Burmese guys who spoke some Indonesian, and wanted her to speak directly to fishermen who were on those boats. And then we'll go on to the rescue after she's done with that. Does that work? I hope I'm not talking too fast. There's just a lot to get in. Hey, yes, you want to go and just talk about, yeah, go.
Yeah, should I continue? Okay. So Robin was there a few days earlier than me, and she asked me to come over because in, the bureau where we are based, I was also covering other news. So I went over to Robin, and it was basically in the middle of nowhere. In the ocean, wide ocean, nothing was out there. I felt like I was going at like the end of the world, and I was like, Rob, what the hell are you doing here? Like, it was kind of that far. And also at the same time, the impression was that how could it be possibly that that many people from Southeast Asia are stuck there, because even by flight you have to travel for about 2.5-3 days, and by boat is about up to 3 weeks. So when I arrived to Benjina, where Robin was, Robin and I kind of cooperated in a way that the island was so controlled by the local authorities that we had to avoid them being, following us almost all the time, or trying to find out where we were at what time. So Robin and I kind of split up in such a way that Robin can divert the attention from these local authorities, while I try to talk to the local, Burmese fishermen on the island across the village. So at that point, the day I arrived there, it was basically, so if you imagine there are two giant hill that is divided by the water, and one side is the company and the other side is the local village. And so normally the fishermen who are based in the company would be able to go to the other side, where they have, like Robin mentioned, there are many other social problems there, prostitution and other sorts of entertainment for men, because they're basically stuck there. What the company normally does with the fishermen is they pretend to pay a little bit of money, just enough to keep them grounded, not protest against the company or anything like that, to not to show that they are paying some money, but which is actually you can't really survive on these money. But of course this fisherman would go for some entertainment. So that's where we actually bumped into some of the fishermen who were speaking Burmese and singing in Burmese, for example. That's how we find out that once we talked to this man, they were from Myanmar, and then they were working in the company currently. So Robin and I started to talk one up to another and one up to another. And then this word spread that we are trying to talk to these men, and then they started to organize themselves, that for the first time in their life, they did have some hope to tell their stories to some journalists who are on the island village. And Robin and I started talking to dozens and dozens and dozens of men on the island. And what we found out was the whole story of why they are stuck there, or why they were stuck there. first of all, they, like Robin mentioned, they were initially trafficked from Myanmar, brought to Thailand with promised jobs like in factories, because Thailand really depends on the Burmese migrant workers. They have about nearly 4 million. Most of them are illegal migrant workers, and most products that are produced in Thailand are made by majority by these migrant workers. So there's always hope that when human traffickers go to, you know, impoverished region in Burma, that they can actually lure villagers who are hopeless, jobless, to promising them to work in factories or other types of businesses in Thailand, and then they always end up, especially men, and ended up being sold to the fishing boats directly. Some of them actually were drugged and kidnapped against their will. Some of them were lied to or lured into another country. So we started to collect or connect the dots from one point to another of how they exactly get from Myanmar to all the way to Benjina. And also we were able to gather all this information about how long this business has been ongoing. I mean, based on the interviews that came up with fishermen, that some of them have been enslaved for over 20 years or stuck in the island for over 20 years. So some of these, the information that we gather was so much that Robin and I wasn't able to really digest, even because it was just so horrible in terms of human trafficking and human rights abuses and enslavement. So so the impression was we got the stories from the fishermen, and then Robin and I also started gathering information on the fishing boats numbers, for example, gathering them, because these fishermen were telling like, okay, we work on this fishing boats, and then we need to know what number these fishing boats were, because there are just hundreds, if not thousands, because they're spreading all across different islands in this region. So sometimes some of the fishermen were also, if they complain or when they request to the captains, so normally the captains of the boats, of the fishing boats, are normally Thai, because they have more authorities, and then people who work underneath them are the manual labor who are mostly trafficked. And if somebody complained after they don't get paid for many years, getting tortured on the fishing boats, then they started to say, you know, I don't want to work here anymore. I just want to go back home. When somebody raised these issues, they are tortured, beaten, and put in cages. So in the middle of the compound where the company is, they build basically a cage-like cells to keep fishermen who refuse to work or who refuse to obey the boat's captain. For example, sometimes they're put there to starve. They got beaten first and then put in cages. So there are really grave human rights abuses ongoing in there. And through that, we were able to collect not only just ourselves, but also a lot of fishermen were so eager to tell their stories about what they had been through over the past years. They themselves were helping us, also collecting information from other friends who couldn't get out of the company. So they even, for example, offered to take our camera into the company compound and really interview their friend by themselves and get us a lot of information. So these are the work that Robin and I did on the island when we were there together. And then after that, as Robin just mentioned, after the ship was tracked back to Thailand, we literally had to go back in Thailand. Robin, Margie, it's just all women. We literally follow trucks that will loaded with fish from the actual Silver Sea boat that were coming from Indonesia. So we actually, because it was so incredibly hard to track where this fish would go, and we tracked them literally one by one. We follow after these trucks that were taking fish from the Silver Sea into different storage, like frozen storage sheds. And that's when Robin mentioned how incredibly it so hard to track this, because there are most of these like frozen factory or frozen sheds did not have any names. So Thailand is like, as we mentioned earlier, it's almost like a lot of gray area, a lot of mafia type businesses, and neighborhood, like a small scale business that looks like a small scale, but then at the end it went to the bigger company that is unable to track. So that's what we did, following one by one. And then maybe Robin might want to jump in, that we were able to track one of them that was connected to the Thai Union. Correct?
I just want to jump in really quickly, because what Esther was saying about the men helping and you know, taking incredible risks to help us do these interviews. One of the most remarkable ones, and pretty much like the I guess it was like the banner shot and video for our story, was one of the men in the cage. And Esther tried to do it, but when the security guards were, you know, like not standing near there, because they weren't suspecting anything. And as soon as she realized that they starting to come back, one of the guys offered to, you know, we showed him how to use, showed him how to use the camera, and he agreed to go back. And because he, you know, that was one of his friends, and they weren't suspicious of the guys on the compound talking to the guys in the cages. He took a video and interviewed him and asked him questions about like, how did he end up there? And it was really powerful and dangerous for these guys. And I think a lot of times as reporters, when you're writing about human rights issues, you are constantly worried about like, what is going to be the, is there going to be any retaliation for these guys? And I've never been in a situation where the guys were victims of abuse, were so willing to talk. I mean, I asked, you can probably, I mean, I think you agree with this, like they really felt almost like they were already dead. And what they wanted was their families to know that they were alive, that they hadn't just left them, you know, and found a better life somewhere, that they had actually, you know, were alive and missed their families. But so I'll go a little bit to the, you know, we were able to use import records to trace back the fish to these companies. There's a site called Panjiva and another one called Import Genius, which is really good at, you know, basically it includes, if you use the paid version, you can get the bills of lading from boats, from companies to see where they're buying fish, how much, the type of fish. So we were able to track that through that custom data. And when the story, you know, there was a lot of, you know, once we made the connections, I'll talk a little bit about this, about the, you know, the pressure of competition kind of moving okay, well, I'll put it, let me just go this way. We got this, before the story came out, we had to make a decision, you know, even though these men felt comfortable using their faces, their real names, everything on video, we didn't believe that they understood what could possibly happen to them. I mean, when we started talking to people who have been involved in this world for a while, they said, you know, like these fishing captains could kill them if they find out that they were talking to you, or they see this footage, they are not safe. It could be worse than being beaten. And so we made the decision, and this is really kind of considered to be crossing an ethical line in journalism, but I think most people, we got approval from our bosses, and I think most people, I mean, we actually got a lot of recognition for it being a positive ethical decision. Anyone we mentioned in the story by name and photograph or the video, we decided that the only way we would do that was if we could make them safe before the story came out. So we worked with IOM, which worked with the Marine Police, gave them the list, pictures of the men that we were going to quote, and their names, and they arranged a rescue of the 8 men that we featured in the story before it published. And as soon as they were rescued, we pushed the button and the story went out. And the impact of that was huge. It was especially big because we could use the picture of the man in the cage and everything else. I mean, most of these interviews that we did were done, we did 2 interviews. One would be like a silhouette, so that if we needed to protect their identity, we could use that. And then one would be their real face and name, so that, you know, like when that decision was made, we'd have both options. But I think they wanted to be heard. They wanted their stories to be told, and they wanted their families to see them. So I think we were really proud to be able to give them their voice and their stories. And I think it really is what gave it the power. It had a huge impact. It ran everywhere. The Indonesian fisheries minister was furious, not at us, but at the Thai boats, Thai captains, Thai companies that had been basically stealing fish from her oceans, but also using it as, basically having a slave island that was not, that she did not know about, and abusing people to this degree on her property in the name of fishing. And so she sent a team to go investigate and see, was this correct? Go interview the men. I went back with her team and a photographer and a videographer. And they were initially just supposed to kind of look at their nets, see if they were paying taxes, interview the men, figure out what the next step was going to be. But when they talked to them and they got their stories, they were so horrified. They decided, you are not going to spend another night on this island. Anyone who wants to go, raise your hand, and we will make sure we get you off. And everybody raised their hand. There were hundreds of guys. And so they started, basically put them back on the boats that had enslaved them for all those years and got them off that island. Those were the first 300, and then it ended up being other people from other islands coming and going back and finding people who had been hiding in the forest and had been afraid to come out that day. And the number was well over 2,000. I think before when we published it was 2,000, but it had gone up to quite a bit above that, I think close to 3,000. So that was the big kind of direct impact thing that you don't see very often. I mean, as journalists, I think, and any policy people, anyone who's doing this kind of work, you rarely see an impact of your work so directly and so quickly. But I think it is because we were able to make those direct lines, and people were able to hear the stories and understand their complicity. And basically it was like, I think both S and I, who have reported on human rights abuses, and Margie and Martha as well, like, believed that there would be that they would get helped. I mean, I don't think usually when you talk to people who've been abused, you feel bad because like, okay, it's good to get this voice out. It will be part of making a difference. It'll be part of getting policy change and everything else. But it's a very hard, and I don't know, it's really hard to leave people and know that you're not going to be able probably to be able to help them specifically directly. And that's really what, as journalists, like, made this story different in that we felt it before we even left and when they were rescued. Yeah. It's pretty intense.
I guess back then we did expect that there could be some changes, but we didn't expect it would be that quick and that dramatic within 2 months, right? And Robin and I actually, before we left the island during our reporting trip, we have like men approaching us after the interview, before we left, that they were giving us like some pictures when they were young with their mothers or fathers, to go back and let them know that they are still alive, because they have been gone sometimes for a decade or 7-8 years, that they've never heard, or their family never heard back from them. So Robin and I actually kind of felt like that's the least we could do when we go back to Myanmar, to let the family know at least that they are still alive. And we did exactly that right after we went back from the island. And once the story was exploded, and when people were rescued, we were able to also not just report, but also were there to see the reunion of family and the fishermen as well.
Yeah, tell us the story about the